What are we to make of suffering in the world? What are we to make of injustice? Perhaps we've been victims of some level of injustice or hypocrisy or suffering ourselves. And wonder, is there any point to it? What are we to make of institutions that seem to fail us, and of a society that seems set up for our unhappiness at times? Well, these are some of the questions that Thomas Hardy poses in his novel, and which we'll be looking at today.
Being unwanted again. Walk in the park, in your hands.
If you'd like to become more informed about the greats of English literature, or you're studying this book for an exam, or you're just reading for pleasure and would like to get more out of your reading, in this video I will be looking at the ideas the novel tackles, the historic context from which the novel came, and the questions that it poses. Above all, we'll be looking at the life lessons we can learn from a 130-year-old novel, published as it was right at the cusp of the birth of our modern world and its transition from an earlier Victorian period with different morals and different priorities. By the end of this video, we'll know more than just what the novel is about. We'll have a sound idea of how the novel can be interpreted. What are the main themes that it addresses? And how can it speak to us in the period in which we live? We'll look at how it's been interpreted through the past and what we can learn from it today. This is history and literary criticism for everyone and anyone, as we look at Thomas Hardy's Tess of the Durbervilles, published in 1891. This video will contain plot spoilers, and as a friendly trigger warning, there are references in the book and in this video to sexual violence. How alert are we to imbalances of power in relationships and wider society? How conscious are we of those that seem to slip through the net, constantly subject to powers beyond their control? And how can we make a world fair when the gods themselves seem to be sleeping? It's 1891. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. The world is mechanized, and new questions arise about our place in this world. John Constable had depicted pastoral beauty and the simple wisdom of rural life. Charles Dickens had written about the plight of the urban poor. William Morris and John Ruskin had offered critiques of industrialization, and Helen Blackburn had established the Women's Employment Defence League as the first wave of feminism began to take shape. A 50-year-old Thomas Hardy attempted to publish his novel Tess of the Durbervilles, but three of the major publishers of the day refused to accept it on the grounds that it was indecent. He struggled and eventually serialized it in a magazine, but in 1891 it was published in the single volume similar to what we have today. But the outcry was immense. Libraries refused to stock it. There was an overwhelming negative reaction from many of the literary establishment and critics. And Thomas Hardy decided perhaps this was a step too far, as he contemplated giving up writing novels altogether. So what's the story of this scandalous novel? John Durbervilles, a haggler who trades in poultry and vegetables, is presented with the idea that he's in fact a descendant and long-lost cousin of the notoriously noble Durberville family. He and his wife decide to send their beautiful young daughter Tess to the Durbervilles to claim kin. There she meets the son of the Durberville family, Alec, who becomes infatuated with her. What we discover in the novel is that in fact the claim to the Durberville name is spurious. The Durberville family simply took the name to hide their tradesman roots. But now Tess has the problem of an infatuated young man in the shape of Alec, who is a predator. And this takes us to the next step. Tess and Alec find themselves in the Chase, a stretch of country where liaisons can occur. Tess is seduced, certainly subdued, possibly raped by Alec. And the result is a birth of a boy that she names Sorrow. Sorrow dies shortly after. And Tess is left with a terrible decision. She wants the child to be baptised, but there's no one to do it. So she does it herself. Eventually, the local vicar does arrive. She pleads with him to let the child be buried in a cemetery, part of the church grounds. Reluctantly, he does eventually agree to allow Sorrow to be buried in a shady corner, a nettled corner of holy ground. After a period of reflection and soul-searching, Tess decides to start a new chapter of her life in a section of the book called The Rally. She finds employment at Talbot Hayes Farm as a milkmaid, and the owner of the farm is a man called Angel Clare. They fall in love. He's a man who's rejected a university and service in the ministry and decided to live a pastoral life, and in Tess he believes he's found an example of rustic innocence, purity and charm. And their love is genuine. And on their wedding night, after a period of soul-searching, Tess decides to tell him about her past and the child Sorrow that was born as a result of it. Angel is furious. He feels angry and betrayed. And they part. He decides to go to Brazil to start a new venture as a businessman there, but he's broken-hearted. And Tess herself, of course, is, again, found to be picking up the pieces of a desperate life made all the worse by forces beyond her control. She's walking past a church as she's returning to her family, and in the church she hears preaching. The voice sounds familiar. It's none other than Alec, the father of her deceased child. Alec very quickly decides to leave the service of church preacher and decides to try and seduce Tess all over again. For a while, Tess lives as his lover, and then Angel decides, having failed in his business venture in Brazil, to return and seek her out. Tess and Alec fight violently, and in the fight, Tess stabs Alec and he dies. She runs away with Angel, and they have 5 peaceful, happy days together, until eventually, while walking across Stonehenge in the mist, she's discovered by the authorities and is eventually tried and hanged. The central theme of the novel is, of course, injustice visited upon an innocent person. Thomas Hardy describes Tess in the subtitle of the book, used from its first publication, as a pure woman. We're reading here not of a grand person, a lord, lady or duke, or someone of nobility or royalty, or of a queen, priestess or goddess, but of a rural young farm labourer, almost a nobody. There was in the Victorian period a renewed interest in the forgotten wisdom of rural innocence, of pastoral. You have William Morris, the arts and crafts movement, trying to move away from the industrialised, mechanised world, where it was believed human spirit and human soul would struggle to exist in any meaningful way. And so a return to a more pastoral, rural existence was seen by some as a return to innocence, a return to forgotten, important wisdoms, and a return to purity. Mankind had, after all, been born in a garden, in a rural setting. But Tess here is placed in a mechanical process. The corrupting mechanics of social injustice and dominant male sexual power place her in a position where she's subject to forces beyond her control. The machine that consumes her is one that thrives on guilt, sorrow, poverty, self-doubt, and shame. And the machinery that whirls around her drives her to her ultimate fate. And fate is a theme in Hardy's novel, Tess of the Durbervilles. The omniscient narrator is a voice that's themselves resigned to the outcome that is written for her. Once the people, the characters, and the power politics of her sexual abuse are all in place, there's really only one outcome that can befall her. Tess's fate is, unfortunately, inexorable, and the novel drives us constantly towards that end. The earliest version of the book, as it was serialized in magazine form, was stripped of any kind of profanity, and so readers had to await the earliest publication of the novel book form in order to really unpack the scene at the chase where Tess is sexually assaulted by Alec. But even then, Hardy refuses to be completely clear about the nature of the event. We don't know if Tess was asleep, whether she was drugged, to what extent she was alert, but what we do know from reading the section in the chase is that Tess was not given the opportunity of any choice in the matter. Hardy is very clear that the sexual action of Alec on Tess is a type of violence for which Tess has to pay the price. At this point in the narrative, Hardy asks a very important question. While Tess is subject to this awful act of sexual violence, where was her guardian angel? Perhaps, Hardy says, he was too busy with other matters, talking, on a journey somewhere, or perhaps he was simply asleep and didn't want to be awoken. The gods of Hardy's novel are ambivalent to our suffering, and we are left blind to the fate that will befall us. After the scene at the chase, Tess becomes the subject of gossip, as her people whisper it was to be. The scene at the chase invokes a kind of medieval hunt. Chase is a piece of land reserved for hunting, and in medieval literature we see the hunter chasing a white hind or deer. Thomas Wyatt's famous sonnet, "Whoso list to hunt," depicts a hunter who is frustrated by attempts to catch the white hind, which, he bemoans, belongs to Caesar, the king. At the chase, Tess is described as a white muslin figure, while the chase itself is wrapped in thick darkness, and Alec is a monster in the shadows. Before we become too bleak with all of this fate and violence, we should note that Hardy's novel serves as criticism of the social order that makes this fate so mechanically certain. One way of reading this is to acknowledge that if the gods are asleep and the machine of male violence and social pressures is left unattended, then it becomes our responsibility. We can point out that the novel is a piece of fiction, of realist fiction, but that does not mean that it lacks ideals. In the same way that Dickens' social criticism of the plight of the urban poor in his novels engaged society in willing and acting for change, Hardy's novel is an injunction to act precisely because the gods themselves are asleep. We're beginning to think of the novel as being very much grounded in this world, while the gods slumber. And while we might think of poets and novelists classically writing about the spiritual realm and the spiritual dimension to the material world, then you'd be right. Hardy is writing poetically about this material world. It's more Aristotelian than Platonic in that regard. And yet Thomas Hardy does write beautifully poetically about mud, about rain, about the soil, and Tess's place in that material world. She gets drenched, she gets covered in mud, she gets besmirched with the toil and labour of this world. And come on, good boy. And this very much is a place of work. Hardy's Wessex is not some idyllic playground of poets musing by a river's side. It's more a place of labour and toil and work and effort. There's barely a chapter in the novel that doesn't describe at some level the amount of purely difficult, hard labour and graft that has to happen. And even when modernity does seep into Tess's world, as when she works a threshing machine, a piece of agricultural technology, it's backbreaking work. It seems to seep her energy and strength and vitality. This sort of juxtaposition between the modern world, or the world of modernity and technology and industry, and the rural world of Tess, is one that I think is done purposefully. There are certainly further juxtapositions in the novel. While Tess is constantly presented to us as being pure and innocent, the work that she performs is so often brutally slave-like. She's driven to do extensive hard manual labour, as are her farm-working colleagues. Their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations are reduced to simply being hands upon the plough and upon the threshing machine. Hardy also likes to take us from a wide-angle, panoramic view of Wessex, straight down very suddenly to the microscopic, as we'll see in a moment. It's a technique he uses several times in the novel. And in some ways the novel is an exercise in focus. In some ways Tess is nobody, anybody. And of course in other ways she's everything. And this is made clear by the way that he writes very suddenly in microscopic ways about details regarding her embedded in the countryside. Listen to how Hardy describes Tess in panoramic terms within the landscape of Wessex, and then suddenly focuses on the microcosm of her life. She found herself to be standing on a carpeted level which stretched out east to west as far as the eye could reach. The river had stolen from the higher tracks and brought in particles, the vale and all its horizontal land, and now, exhausted, aged, and attenuated, lay serpentining along through the midst of its former spoils. Not quite sure of her direction, Tess stood still upon the hemmed expanse of verdant flatness, like a fly upon a billiard table of indefinite length, and of no more consequence to the surroundings than the fly. I've often thought of this passage from Tess of the Durbervilles. I've loved it ever since I read it as an undergraduate. And picture the green expanse of land, and then suddenly zooming in to Tess as if she's a fly on a billiard table. If it sounds film-like, then perhaps there's reason for us to think so. Thomas Hardy's novel Under the Greenwood Tree was the first talking movie made in Britain. And filmmakers, directors often use this technique now. It's quite common to us, of having a wide angle view, giving us a context for the character before zooming in and showing us the eyes or some small detail of the character. It's a common technique now. I'm unaware of this particular technique being used anywhere in literature before Hardy, but he certainly made it a particular skill of his in the novels that he wrote. In some ways, a novelist is like a camera, showing us precisely what they intend to, honing our focus upon something that is impossibly large and vast without this intended focus and vision. In some ways, our main character, Tess, in the novel, is like an insignificant fly, or perhaps like Eve in the Garden of Eden, wandering alone, exploring, touching and understanding the world and the universe around her. The juxtapositions continue. At a point in the novel, Tess and Angel travel to a train station to deliver milk to the strange people of London for them to drink for their breakfast, although they have to water it down in order to be able to stomach it. They don't know anything about us, Angel tells her. Noblemen, ambassadors, babies, who have never seen a cow. Here, London is an alien world, full of alien creatures, and yet it's only a train ride away from Claire's farm. Hardy describes it as the Jacobean world and the modern world coexisting. Hardy was fascinated with rural superstitions and folk tales, and there are plenty of those in the novel. And yet a few miles away, modern, elite, urban, educated people sip the milk from the land. It's a juxtaposition that Hardy returns to often. Marxist criticism of Hardy's novel might focus on the way in which manual labourers and farm labourers are exploited by urban elites who drink milk from a source they themselves are alienated from, and also the poverty and hardship of Tess's family. The way in which Alec Durbervilles' pretended noble name is a kind of talisman that holds power, and to Tess a very real power, even though it's as hollow as a milk churn that's empty. Marxist criticism also might focus on the way in which Tess herself is exploited, almost by every character in the novel in some way or another. Her family have high hopes that her attempts to claim kin with the Durberville family may bring some form of economic and social prosperity. Of course, that is to fail, and we're left to see in some ways the repercussions of that failure. There is some evidence that Hardy had socialist sympathies. His childhood friend Horace Mule was a committed socialist and introduced Hardy to the ideology. And Hardy himself described his first unpublished novel as socialistic. A feminist reading of Tess of the Durbervilles would focus perhaps on examining the power difference between men and women in the novel. Tess is presented as someone whose perceived purity and innocence is something that comes under the gaze of more than one male in the novel. Alec, of course, seeks to possess her, but doesn't completely possess Tess from the incident at the chase. Her perceived purity is referred to again and again in the novel, and I suppose with the subtitle of the novel being A Pure Woman, it must have led readers at the time to re-examine what's meant by purity and what it means to be a pure woman. The novel is liminal in many ways. Hardy resists giving us a clear depiction of Tess's appearance. Her eyes are neither green nor brown nor blue. And it's set in a fictional Wessex which matches town for town, southwestern England, but with new names. So it's halfway between reality and a fictional world that Hardy created. Of course, it's full of superstitions and folklore and traditions of rural life, but it's written to be read by an urban audience who the novel challenges to examine their moral conscience. And while Hardy imbues the novel with a kind of spiritual power in which people are pushed towards their fate, it's entirely scathing of religion. As when Tess wants her baby Sorry to be baptized, she simply does it herself and is somewhat resistant to religious authority. The society that first read the novel was itself on the precipice of an enormous change from older, perhaps Victorian ways of seeing the world and a new modern way, radically different from the old world. For example, while Oscar Wilde and Charles Dickens are considered Victorian authors and poets, Thomas Hardy is now considered to be an author of modernity, a new historical episteme. Of course, Hardy was only born a few years after Oscar Wilde. The 1890s was a period of transition from old structures of power to radically new ways of seeing the world, new feminism, and a dismantling of the old religious powers of the establishment. And these changes would only continue throughout Hardy's life, eventually leading to a global world war, which Hardy would live to see. In addition, a new artistic trend was emerging, in which the hunger for realism had abated. The Impressionists had shown how painting could convey something more intensely by throwing out realism in favour of highlighting and heightening certain aspects of light and colour. And Hardy, by his own admission, was trying to throw out of proportion certain aspects of reality in order to show a new dynamic reality and the world as it really is. The advent of photography had changed the artistic world forever. Artists no longer sought to depict the world in as realistic a sense as possible. Photographs could do that easily. So artists sought to depict the world in a different way. An artist might focus on the way that the light plays on a lily pond, or an author might seek to depict a woman appearing as a fly upon a billiard table as she traverses a green valley in Wessex. At the end of chapter 14, when Tess is pleading with the minister to allow Sorry to be buried on holy ground, she asks him not to speak to her as minister to parishioner or saint to sinner, but to speak to her as you yourself, to me myself. So there's a suggestion here that within the inner world of the priest there is a human being, a humanist being, and that religious authority is a kind of negotiation, a negotiation where the mask can be taken off. And when Tess pleads with him to tell her whether the baptism she performed would have the same effect as if he had performed it, Hardy tells us that the minister had within himself a fight between the ecclesiastic and the person within, and that the rational man within him won. In other words, Tess is asking the minister to move from the script of what he is supposed to do and say, and that the conflict that arises within him is between the mantle of religious authority that he wears and the inner man within. The implication is that even ministers are understood to have an inner humane person who can resist the official script and do the right thing. The novel rests heavily on the idea that within each of us there is a humane, humanist being who is willing to overcome the hierarchies and power structures that surround us, that within the mask of the outward person is a conscious, rational being. Eventually, the vicar does allow sorrow to be buried in a nettled corner of the churchyard. And interestingly, it's not God's displeasure that bothers him. Rather, it's the awkward administrative complications and the censure of his superiors that worries him. Hardy gives us few genuinely religious people in the novel. We have the simple mix of pagan practice and Christian belief among rural people, and the nervous young vicar that visits the child sorrow. Angel's faith and that of his brothers, and the insincere preachments of Alec, whose sunshine faith is easily overshadowed by the gentle presence of Tess, attest to the fact that religious belief is a negotiation built upon the platform of a humanist, rational being. Hardy's criticisms of religion aside, there is in the novel this consistent belief that people within themselves are just people, and that we are so often awkwardly humane, more likely to bend in clumsy sympathy rather than snap in righteous judgment. What is given a kind of holy sacredness in the novel is the natural world, as Tess walks through juicy grass shrouded in misty pollen, the flowers of weeds whose red and yellow and purple hues formed a dazzling polychrome, cuckoo spittle at her skirts, thistle milk and slug slime staining her arm, her eyes shimmering with tears, the waves of a second-hand harp pressing like a breeze through her. What we read here is more like Eve moving silently through the garden, similar to the early modern sonnets in which a woman is likened to nature itself. And yet, in Hardy's writing, Tess is crushing snail shells under her foot and covered in slug slime. It tells us that Tess is more connected to nature, less ruled by it, and less ruled by man's instinct to tame and subdue. Tess isn't a visitor to a garden. She's more like the product of the landscape itself. Later in the book, after she disastrously confesses to Angel her past, she's left to the job of grubbing for Swedes in the mud, and with a co-worker she scratches and scrapes with her hands to pull the Swedes from the mud. Again, Hardy uses the symbol of the fly. They appear, he says, like flies in the mud. This is humiliating work, and yet Hardy tells us that the justice or injustice of it doesn't even occur to her. And I think because of this, her being both the lady of the garden and the fly in the mud, without any interest in thinking about the justice or injustice of it, only heightens that feeling of injustice that we have within us. Which is why we can read Tess of the Durbervilles as a kind of call to arms, a call to change things, to address these injustices, a kind of revolutionary tract, calling us to be the better version of ourselves, the humanist self within. Although the Russian Revolution was still a couple of decades away, there were whispers of change across Europe, and stories of a mistreated and humiliated labouring farm girl were perhaps small slithers of kindling that would lead to a burning down of the entire establishment in some countries. The novel certainly tells us that industrious, hard-working, and pure women like Tess can be utterly failed by the system. The novel closes with the raising of the black executioner's flag, and we're left, ironically, with a moment in which the gods, who themselves had slept through her initial sexual abuse, are now suddenly awake and alert. Justice, Hardy tells us in inverted commas, had seemed to be done, and the gods themselves had finished their game toying with Tess. So what are we to make of Hardy's novel? It's clear that the world doesn't always give us what we ask of it. We are, like Tess, embedded in the flow of history over which we have very little or no control. We're ourselves sometimes like a fly on a billiard table, alone and unimportant, and unable to turn the world to our rhythm. But the good thing about a billiard table is that it's flat. We can see the horizon that's pulling us. In order to make progress, similar to Tess, we need to keep moving, keep walking. We need to rally. Hardy works hard to disestablish hierarchies. The name Durberville is itself a fake, a fraud. It's a hollow mask to hide working or middle class roots, leading us to imagine that in a sense all aristocratic names are merely the result of very terrestrial games, not the work of a divine calling. Religious authority itself is also undermined in the book. A woman baptizing her dying infant son has the same effect as if a priest were to have done it. The governing principle in Hardy's novel, in his universe of this novel, is not nobility or the priesthood or wealth, but compassion. The only times Tess is shown compassion is when people engage with their inner humanity. The minister, when she pleads with him to allow her infant son to be buried on holy ground. An angel, when he is humbled by his business failures in Brazil, finally connects with enough compassion within him to overlook her past. In other words, there's no way of rising above the mess of this world without bringing the mess with you to some degree. And so it behooves us to connect compassionately with other people. There's no way of getting ourselves beyond this world. And so we must rise together, and that means connecting with our inner compassion. The gods are either asleep, or if they're awake, they're more likely to be judgmental. So there's no higher being in this world than a compassionate person. And lastly, our purity, and the purity of Tess, is not dependent on the selfish and violent acts of other people, but it's upon our willingness to rally and keep walking, keep moving forward, step by step. That concludes my thoughts about Tess of the Durbervilles for this video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, if it's benefited you at all, feel free to like and subscribe. I will be bringing out further videos where we look at other books of literature. My name's Dr. John. I have a doctorate in English literature. It's been my pleasure to share this with you.